So, well, normally when I'm talking to people about Crockett, I'm talking about his fiction. But I thought that given that this is a family history society, that maybe the key element would be to focus on family history research, and that would more often fall under fact. However, I'd like to suggest that there is an inevitable blurring of boundaries between fact and fiction, not just for Crockett, but for most people's family history research. And some of the things that I'll think about in my talk is what can we actually discover and what can we actually know from what we discover. To that end, I think the quote that you see on the screen here is quite appropriate. And I often use this one with Crockett because I think it's very apposite to his work and his life. And it is, the actual connections are never the ones you think of. I've certainly found that to be true in all of my research with Crockett. So I'm guessing that most people here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but most people here are probably primarily interested in family history and possibly in, as that relates to Balmaghie, and secondarily interested in S.R. Crockett. So I'm thinking of using him pretty much as a kind of case study, because he was very famous, but is now fairly obscure. And because he was famous in life, there's an awful lot of facts that one can derive from him, as well as an awful lot of fiction. And it might just give people some pause for thought about their own research and some connections that they had perhaps never thought of. So off we go. Okay, sorry, mouse, over exuberant mouse there. So I, as the introduction said, have fallen heir to a research archive, and this is it, in case you had thoughts that a research archive looked like a really swishy thing. No, this is it. It's about 30 boxes, and these are all absolutely stuffed full with papers. So it's a real blessing because I have access to lots and lots of information, but it's also something of a curse because the archives were not put together in any sense of real order. Research archives are useful to the person who was doing the research at the time, perhaps, but less so to anyone who comes after. And I was not primarily an archivist, so finding out how to make these into something that I can get information out of has been quite challenging. Every time I have a question, I say to myself, oh, I'm sure the answer's in the archive. But every time I go to the archive, I can get lost there for weeks on end, and then I find something more interesting about something else, and etc., etc. Anyway, I'm not complaining because it means that I do have access to an awful lot of information from the two key scholars on S.R. Crockett of, I suppose we should say, the 20th century, the first being Dr. Isla Murray Donaldson and Richard D. Jackson. And so effectively, in all my work, I'd say these are the giants upon whose shoulders I reside. So the facts, as we know them, about Crockett are that he was born Samuel Crockett with one T on the 24th of September 1859 at Little Duckery in the parish of Balmaghie. And he died as Samuel Rutherford Crockett with two T's on the 16th of April 1914 in Tarascon in France. He's buried at Balmaghie Kirk, and the recent publications of the graveyards at Balmaghie Kirk are really interesting to look into. And they show 3 gravestones of Crockett family. So it's a fairly extensive family. There's also a memorial to him in Lauriston, which was erected in 1932. And it was erected by public subscription, including who was, well, what we knew as the Queen Mother, who wasn't the Queen Mother then, of course, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, I suppose. She put in some money towards it. And it's, I think, always worth remembering that, there we go, you know, he was so famous that by royal assent, if you like, they knew him then, and today virtually nobody's heard of him. There's also, factually, nearly 70 published books and hundreds of published stories and articles, which were written between 1878 and 1914. So that he's well known as Scotland's forgotten bestseller. I say nearly 70 published books because it's always very difficult to work out what are editions, and some are given under different titles in America. And I reckon it's about 66, but there's books of short stories and things as well as novels. So the other facts that we can look at, here's some photographic fact. This is the first known picture of the great man. His father, William Crockett, his mother, Annie Crockett, and young Sam. And if I just close in on that, I think it's quite appropriate that the picture that we see, the first picture we see of Samuel Crockett, is of a mysterious blob. And I think that, yeah, his face as a mysterious blur is quite a good analogy for everything that comes to follow, be that fact or fiction. It is a fact that he was born here at Little Duckery. You can see during his fame, they were touting it as the birthplace of S.R. Crockett. This would be not entirely contemporary with his birth, but it wouldn't have been very long afterwards. And if we look at how it looks now, you'll see there's quite a difference. The quote I've put here is another Crockett quote. He was well aware of the changes of time. As he said, time brings changes. The observation's not exactly new, yet we may venture to repeat it. For the man who is listened to is the man who is not afraid to say old things over and over again in his own way. Now, I think looking at how Little Duckery changed from then till now serves perhaps as just pause for thought when we do look back into the past, and we sort of assume that certain things must be the same when we're looking towards them. But houses and landscape and pretty much everything has changed, certainly in the last 150 years. And so therefore, when one looks at fact or fiction, I think it's interesting to remember that nothing is going to be the same, and that the way we see it, whether it's trees or rivers or whatever, all these things may have a difference. And this is one of the reasons why I find Crockett's fiction can be interesting, especially the fiction he writes that's set during his own childhood or youth, because then when he's writing from memory, he's writing about the things that he actually saw. So from the point of view of social history, if you read one of his works that was contemporary to his time or written based in the 1850s through to the 1890s, you get some picture of what life was like then. Because as a writer, it's a lot easier just to write from your memory of how things were, or you described the road out of your house as it is, as you remember it as a child or as it is now. You're not going to make that sort of thing up. So while there's a lot of made up things within the fiction, within Crockett's fiction, an awful lot of it, especially if you're interested in Galloway, well, or I suppose his European one's the same in Europe, but if you're interested in the social history of the time that he was writing, then it's really worth reading the books to find out. He writes history as well, and obviously when he's writing about Covenanting times, he's writing at it from the perspective of the 19th century, and therefore we can't say he's accurately writing about how the history or the landscape or something was in the 16th century. He's doing it from a 19th century perspective. But at least a third to a half of his works are set in the 19th century. And therefore, if your interest, as mine is in the mid to late 19th century, very early 20th century, you can find an awful lot of interesting social history, especially about rural life at that time, through looking at his works. So there's a plug for his books. I said I was going to stay with fact. So back to the facts. Here's his family tree. This was pulled together by Dr. Donaldson. And I'm not going to focus on it too closely because it's just an extensive family tree, but presumably of interest to people who do their own family history research. And I don't know how clearly you can see any of this. I'm not closing in on it, but there's lots of other names that are relevant, which you yourselves might find of interest. There's Hislops, there's Maxwell's, there's Lecky's, there's Young's, there's Gifford's, there's I'm just looking across, there's Dinwiddie's, Crawford's. There's lots of people who have relations to Crockett in Balmaghie and Galloway and further abroad, especially towards Edinburgh. for he had quite a lot of family that went and stayed in Edinburgh. So again, if you're going back through your own family trees towards the 1820s, 30s, 40s, etc., and you've got connections in Galloway and specifically, in Balmaghie or around there, then it's very worth having a look at the Crockett connection, either through these facts, but also again through his fiction, because he writes about a lot of local people. Often he changes their names, but sometimes they're not very obviously, not very far changed. So it's quite possible to draw some connections between real people and the people in his fiction. However, I thought I'll take a hatches, matches and dispatches approach to trying to go through his history. And the first thing that we have here is his birth certificate in 1859 in the parish of Balmaghie. And if we close in on that, there's some interesting things to look at. First of all, you'll see he was Samuel Crockett, 1T. It was 1859, and his mother was Anne Crockett, single T, a dairymaid. Then the most significant fact, perhaps, is the one circled in red, and it shows illegitimate. Okay, now this was the thing that would cause quite a long shadow through his entire career. Not necessarily personally, because through the family, it wasn't a stigma, but within the social mores of the time, it was a fairly stigmatizing thing. And so as he became more famous, it was certainly something that was at best swept under the carpet, I suppose. And I guess we could just say it was fictionalized. He was brought up with his maternal grandparents and mother at Little Duckery, but his grandfather William retired, although within some of his fiction, one might suggest he was kicked out of his tenancy. Again, fiction is somewhat different from what we hear as fact, and it's difficult to know which is which. But on this retirement in 1867, the family moved to Cotton Street in Castle Douglas, and this is a picture of their house. Now, it was number 24 in those days, but there've been lots more houses put on Cotton Street since then. And so I think it's about 124 now. And I'm not sure conclusively which of the three doors within this building it actually was. I think it was the middle door, but not entirely sure. But anyway, this is where he grew up from 1867, so when he was about 6 or 7, until he left at the age of 17. The next document that we have comes from 1879, and it's a death record for his mother. And you'll note here, I'll go in close on it again, that she's now called Annie Crockett, still single T. We've got the father, William Crockett, and the mother, Mary Crockett. We note from the left-hand side that she's still single. And we also see Samuel Crockett with a single T listed as her son. We also can see what she died of, but I can't pronounce that. It's pulmonary tuberculosis. So that's something of importance as well. Now, it was 1879, and at this point in time, Crockett was no longer living in Castle Douglas. He went up to university in Edinburgh in 1876, and in 1879, 1880, he was actually traveling abroad quite a lot as a traveling tutor to some rich person. So he wasn't actually there at the death of his mother, but this is the document. The next document that we have is about 8 years later. It's 1887, and it's a marriage document. It's the marriage of Samuel Rutherford Crockett now to Ruth Mary Milner. I'm going to close in on it again and show you some of the interesting, what I think to be interesting things. Okay, so we'll see that it's Samuel Rutherford Crockett with a double T. He's 27, he's a bachelor, and his rank or profession is clergyman. He had just been ordained the November before, and my theory is that one of the main reasons he became a clergyman was because it gave him a level of respectability in order that he could marry the girl who was the daughter of George Milner, who was a manufacturer, basically a large mill owner in Manchester. George Milner also wrote some poetry and also wrote a book about, I think it was the dialect of Lancashire. So Crockett met him through a writing connection initially, and they were a very respectable family, so that perhaps when we see in red the father's name and surname of Samuel Rutherford Crockett at 1887, we see this name David Blaine Crockett, farmer. Now, this can't be entirely true. It can't be entirely factual. There has to be an element of fiction. And I have to say that for me, I look at a copy of an entry of marriage and I go, right, that's a document that must be accurate because it's an official document. So I think it's quite important for us to bear in mind that when we look at official documents, they needn't necessarily be 100% accurate, because this one surely isn't. Even if his father is this guy, David Blaine, it couldn't possibly be David Blaine Crockett, because we know that his mother's name is Crockett, and therefore, if his father was David Blaine, it would just be David Blaine, wouldn't it? So it's clearly some fiction, if not mystery, within this, and what level of truth there is in it is hard to gauge. But you can understand why, of course, it was done, because we just go back to the birth certificate. He's illegitimate. Now, I just suggest that if you're about to marry the daughter of a rich mill owner, and you're a clergyman, you're not going to be jumping up and down saying you're illegitimate in those days. So although I find it sort of mind-boggling that he could knowingly make a document, assign a document that wasn't accurate, you can see the reasons why. And I don't know how common it was, but I suspect it was relatively common. So we should think then, when we look back at official documents from the past, that it's not just that, the spelling changes and things, but these documents needn't be entirely accurate. So everything we count as fact needn't necessarily be so. And that's just, I guess, a bit of a warning to us. Now, Richard Jackson got on the case and decided he was going to try and root down Crockett's father. And he came across this document, which was the 1851 census for Balmaghie. Again, I'll close in on it. And here you can see that at Upper Cray Farm, which is just across from Little Duckery, there's a farmer, James Cochrane, and his family. And living there in 1851 was David Blaine, without the E, and Anne, without either an I or an E, and Crockett, with two T's. They are respectively a farm servant and a house servant, aged respectively 20 and 21. Okay, well, taking aside the vagaries of spellings and E's and I's and T's in names, which we can just say, okay, that's not something to worry too much about. The Crockett name certainly became one T, two T's, one T, two T's. It didn't seem to make any sense at all, just as somebody felt like it. But taking that aside, if it's 1851 and this Anne Crockett is the same Anne Crockett that is Crockett's mother, then she wasn't 21. She would be about 22 or 23. So that's a little bit inaccurate. The other things about this document that I find interesting are, it's 1851. Crockett was born in 1859. So this suggests that if this was his putative father, then the father and the mother knew each other, at least somehow, lived together in some respect, for 8 years or so before he was born. The other fact is that Annie Crockett, when she had Crockett, was about 30 or 31, which to my mind is quite late in those days to be having a child. And so it brings up a whole load of questions about, what were the circumstances around which she fell pregnant? And, we're never going to know these facts. Was it David Blaine? Was it somebody else? Who knows? As far as we can know anything, I can say relatively conclusively, Crockett's family knew who his father was, because there's a letter from one of his uncles, his Uncle Sam in America, who wrote back, and it's in the archive, around the time of her pregnancy. And he was more or less saying he was going to come back and make the father do the right thing. But he never actually did come back. Well, he didn't come back then. And so all we know is that they knew who the father was, but for some reason or other, they never married. Whether we could say that David Blaine actually is the father, or whether that name was used in the marriage certificate, who can say? I certainly don't know, and Richard Jackson spent a lot of time trying to trace it down and didn't really come up with any conclusive facts. But again, it just shows that you can find a certain amount of stuff, but then you come to conundrums which are not entirely clear, and you can't guarantee it, and you have to kind of make up for yourself. Within Crockett's fiction, he writes a lot about illegitimacy, not head on, but in a sort of surreptitious way, and certainly about the relationship between women who are kind of gulled by men or tricked by them, and fallen women to whom he always has a reasonable degree of sympathy. He also writes a lot about hypocrisy of landowners and religious people and all sorts of people. So there's a lot that may be gleaned from his fiction, but again, we can't ever know how much of it is actually true. But here is a picture of Crockett in all his respectable glory, with his Rutherford in the middle and his double T. And this is him about the time that he's beginning to become super famous, which was in 1893, 1894 that he really broke through. And this is an interesting letter from the archive where he's writing to one of his aunts, thanking her for the loan of a book. I've underlined a bit of it. It's the book is the CD, the Castle Douglas Miscellany. And as he says, it's a very scarce book and useful to one who, like myself, is employed a good deal in digging about the antiquities of my native province. So again, for me, this is something of a provenance about that you can glean some fact from his fiction, because he did lots of research in writing his historic works, and obviously wrote a lot about his contemporary time. So we know that he was relying on earlier books and earlier research in order to write what he was writing. Therefore, the fiction is deeply steeped in fact, and I think that's quite important to bear in mind. I also take some solace from it as I dig around trying to find out things about Crockett's own past that he might actually just find it vaguely amusing that that's what I'm doing, rather than find it sort of voyeuristic and defensive that I'm trying to chase down what happened to him. So, as I say, he was very, very famous. He became part of the Victorian cult of celebrity. This is a cartoon that was made of him for caricature that was made of him for Vanity Fair magazine at the height of his fame. And again, from social history, you can glean all sorts of things from this: the costume that he is dressed in, the Ulster coat, etc. And it is worth noting that he was internationally famous. With the archive has lots and lots of contracts that were made for Australia, for America, and yeah, he sold very, very well throughout the entire world. About 2 or 3 boxes in the archive are simply off contracts, and I would have hated to be the person who had to deal with Crockett's contracts because they were really extensive. Part of his fame as well saw him out and about, just because for those who are interested in golf, we're in the middle of the Open, and Crockett learnt to play golf later in life when he became famous, and he had a set of left-handed clubs made for him because he was left-handed, and you can see those clubs. They were made for him specially by Willie Ochterlony, with whom Crockett played, and Crockett played only at St Andrews, and he played with the caddies rather than with the gentlemen. At that point in time, caddies were a professional body, but kind of looked down on. And he did indeed play and once almost beat old Tom Morris. So for those interested in golf, there's an interesting connection with Crockett and golf and St Andrews. I was a graduate of St Andrews, and all the time I was at St Andrews, I'm ashamed to say I had no interest in golf at all. And now, of course, my interest in Crockett and golf in St Andrews is extensive. But the left-handed clubs sadly have been lost. Here are other pictures of Crockett's respectable life, and this and the next one, I think, just show the respectable transition from Victorian to Edwardian. This is him with his wife and at that point 3 children. So that will have been before about just before 1900, I think. And then here's him into Edwardian times with all 4 children. And there they are, a very happy looking, respectable family. However, I suppose when we do family research, we kind of know it's not going to end well in the end, because everybody dies, because they're already dead when we start researching them. And in the archive, we have a couple of letters from Crockett. These are the last letters we have from him in October and December 1913. And they're written from a private hospital in France to a friend. Now, why was he in France? Well, Crockett had ill health through most of his life, and despite looking kind of very big and hale and hearty in the pictures, he first, again, some speculation, it's thought that he contracted malaria probably in Morocco in the 1870s, and that dogged him through his life. He also had a cancerous tumor of the jaw, which was found after he got hit on the jaw with a golf ball in St Andrews at some point in about 1896 or 1897. And there was, of course, TB in his family. So he was being treated for various illnesses for quite a lot of his adult life. But as this letter says, his agent always told him to keep quiet about being ill, because he says that publishers aren't interested in sick authors. Presumably they thought they might die before they'd finished what they were commissioned to write. And so he had to keep very quiet about what his illnesses were. But in this letter, in the first letter, he's pointing out that he's lived off milk for the best part of 13 months. So that would suggest some kind of stomach condition, maybe. And it's possible that if he was being dosed with quinine for malaria, that was actually the wrong thing to give to somebody who had a certain stomach condition. But again, it has to be a certain amount of speculation. He traveled abroad extensively throughout his life, partly because he was interested in travel, but increasingly because, like many people in those days, the conditions in Scotland, in certainly the winter, the dampness of it was just not conducive to health or to indeed staying alive. And so therefore he spent a vast amount of his time abroad, which is one reason why he used to write one Scottish or Galloway novel per year, and generally one that was set in either Spain or France or North Africa or various places, some Germany, some Italian. So these are the letters which are the last ones that we have from him, which is, it's always still quite sad, even though you know that they were dead, but inevitably this is the next step. This is his gravestone in Balmaghie kirkyard. And he was buried according to his wishes. His body was repatriated from France, and he was buried with quite a ceremony. It made the Scotsman, and it was on the 24th of April 1914 that he was buried here among the good and simple folk that he knew when he was growing up, which was what his desire was, despite the fact that the family didn't actually worship at this particular church because they were Free Church, and they went to Castle Dumfries, they were Cameronians. So you can see here that there's some slates at the bottom, and these were added by the Galloway raiders relatively recently, due to the fact that being at the bottom of the gravestone, he was quite difficult to find, but also it's quite a dangerous place to be when there's strimmers around. And indeed, a strimmer took a chunk out of the gravestone not long before we did this, and it had to be repaired. So we just put those slate quotes with quotes from his work up there, thinking that would at least preserve part of the area around it. So we know that he died, but the question then of what he died of becomes like the question of his father, one of these things that the researchers want to find out. And both Dr. Donaldson and Richard Jackson attempted to discover what was going on here. Dr. Donaldson in 1974 wrote this, got this letter back from the people in France, and all the correspondence to this, I'm afraid, is in French, and my French is poor. But the letter basically says that while the French didn't keep records of what people died of for more than 5 years, So therefore, there's no way that they could tell what he actually died of. So that one is one that we're just never going to know, unless a letter turned up where, you know, he writes and says, I am dying of whatever, or somebody says he died of whatever, but there's nothing that we can find of that. However, they did have a death certificate. So this is our final document. Is again quite interesting, although again an element of perhaps somewhat fiction in it. It's a very poorly, it's very poor photocopy, not just on the screen here, but generally, so that I can't see at the top exactly what date of April it was that the death certificate was done. So I don't know who actually was there giving the information. But the information is kind of odd, because first of all, it says that it gives his property, his home, as Auchencairn. Now, the Crockett family had lived in Peebles. They lived in Pennycook since they were married, and then they moved to Peebles in 1906, although because Crockett was traveling, he didn't spend that much time there. They lived in a massive house, which was really accordant to, you know, a celebrity Victorian Edwardian author. But that was a rented property, which was quite common in those days. And Auchencairn was the property that he actually owned, because it was a legacy property to him from his uncles. So that explains why that would put it as Auchencairn rather than as Peebles, I suppose. But then if you look further down, it says he's the son of David Crockett. And if you look further along, Mary Crockett. So we know he's not the son of David Crockett, and Mary was his grandmother, not his mother. So that information is obviously inaccurate to some degree, intentionally or not intentionally, who can say? But there's no David Blaine, it's just David Crockett and Mary Crockett. So this is wrong. It does, however, get right the fact that he's married to Ruth Milner, so that's something, and that he is buried, that he died at Tarason. So what does all that show? Just, I suppose, that every piece of documentation about Crockett is inaccurate to some degree. I hope that in your own family research, things aren't that difficult. Richard Jackson pursued this, as was his will, through many letters with French people, but he didn't find out any more, and he certainly didn't find out what Crockett died of. I'm not about to try for the third time to find out what he died of. I'm fairly sanguine about these things and say, okay, well, some things you're just not meant to know. It wouldn't really make a lot of difference to us if we knew, I suppose. So the final thing that we have, memorial of S.R. Crockett, and here it is, the public subscription in 1932. And the irony of ironies is that this has an error on it as well. This error is his birth date. It lists his birth date as 1860 instead of 1859. And I'm sure it was just some oversight error, but there's a long tail and consequences to these kind of errors, because for generations, all publications written about Samuel Rutherford Crockett date him as being born in 1860. I've been working fairly tirelessly since about 2012, 2013 to try and correct these, but still, you know, if you look in various biographical dictionaries or all kind of things, all the important books, they have the date as 1860. So if you get one that's 1859, you can know that somebody's actually gone in there and managed to change the fact. Of course, it did have something of an impact as well, in that the 150th anniversary of his birth got missed, because that was 2009, and of course everyone thought it would be 2010, and so abroad, nobody knew about it until the year after it had happened, which maybe doesn't seem so odd now that we've just lived through Euro 2020 in the middle of 2021, and we're about to have the Olympics for 2020. Then maybe we've gone back to this thing of, oh, well, what does a year or so matter either way? But yeah, it was one of the reasons why the Galloway Raiders was founded in 2014, was to actually have a centenary event and put things back into the right kind of perspective, because one of the reasons why people fall out of the public eye, I suppose, is because all the details and facts and everything just, you know, get lost and don't seem to be important to people. I like to think, when I think about Crockett, of this quote: all authors have just one hero. That is the self they would have liked to be, the gallant boy they were not, the fellow who defied the master when they whimpered to be let off, who fought the wounded tiger when they would have gladly shinned up a tree. Crockett is a very, very quotable author, I find, and I like to think of this as how he sees himself, that in everything that he writes, as with quite a few authors, everything that he writes has him in it somewhere. But certainly there are some novels in which he's very obviously an alter ego, and others in which he's less clearly so. But he first comes across as one Watty Anderson in some of the earlier works. And then the key work which has him as a central alter ego is Kit Kennedy. And this novel very much follows his childhood from Castle Douglas days up through to Edinburgh. Of course, it's fiction, but I think there's an awful lot of fact within there. Sandy Pride is in a later novel which details quite a lot of stuff about the time that Crockett spent in London, which wasn't extensive, but he had some experiences in London. And Jonathan Lauriston is perhaps the least well-known one, mainly because it wasn't even published during Crockett's lifetime. Jonathan Lauriston is very much a kind of teen rites of passage story, and it was, a lot of the information was used but more fictionalized in The Raiders, which of course is his famous novel. And Jonathan Lauriston, we actually see some of his childhood friends, including Andrew Penman, who later set up the electrical company, and William McGeorge, who became a very famous artist, again now forgotten as an artist. So certainly within the story of Jonathan Lauriston, which is in Rogue's Island, and The Raiders, where these same the real life people are turned into characters in the 18th century, you can find a lot about real people within these fictional stories. And into most of his stories, Crockett writes himself as some kind of a hero, or has some kind of a hero. But the hero is a very ordinary boy with feet of clay who tends to need some woman to tell him to, man up and grow up. And they're all written with a fair dose of what we call Scots humour. And if you miss the Scots humour, then you really miss the point of what they're about entirely. So this is me looking pensively about what Crockett book am I going to read next, amidst the Galloway collection, which is the set of novels that were published in paperback in 2014. It's not the entirety even of books set in Galloway, because sometimes he fictionalizes the stories so much that it was hard. One set in Kirkcudbright, which wasn't called Kirkcudbright, fell off the list for me, but has been added on since. And just to take us back to sort of where we started from and say, here's the place where most of the answers and many, many questions is kept. This is where one might say the fact of Crockett resides within these archives, which I'm desperately hoping someday we'll get back to Galloway. And at present, I'm engaged in trying to work out ways to digitize them and make the information available to people more broadly, because there's just so much information in there. But it's a big project. And this is the entirety of the published book fiction, because so much of it was done in serials and magazines, a lot of which is lost. But these are the books. So any research of Crockett involves quite a lot of reading, which I'm happy to do because they're entertaining books. But even if you don't, as I repeatedly say, if you're not interested in the plots and the stories per se, then if you're interested in Galloway specifically, and if you're interested in the people of Galloway and the places of Galloway and the landscapes of Galloway, then certainly some of these books are interesting to you. Similarly, if you're interested in Spain or Italy, there are stories there, mostly based on historic fact, but turned slightly into fiction. So there's plenty there to keep everyone interested. The Stickit Minister was where it all began, and it's a bit of a shame that the Stickit Minister and the Raiders are pretty much all that people tend to remember of Crockett these days. And they're fine works, but they're not representative of everything that he wrote, any more than you could say Love's Labour's Lost represents Shakespeare. It's one small part of it, and it's worth exploring him more deeply, because I think, as with all research that you do, the deeper you look in, the more you delve out, and you may not get facts out. It may be hidden within fiction, but I still think that it's worth the effort to find what is there. Here you'll see a list of the complete Crockett to show you kind of what I'm engaged in at the moment. I'm going through it chronologically at the moment, but this is set up by sort of categories. It's not that simple, because often the novels start in one place and move to somewhere else. But there's a lot of Scottish novels. There's some children's fiction, purportedly. There's some European set novels. There's some novels set either in England or Scotland more broadly, or they're harder to place. And there's some short story collections and a couple of non-fiction ones as well. So there's pretty much something for everyone. And of course, the question I'm most often asked, and please don't ask me it today, is which one should I start with? Because it's impossible to say which one any other person should start with. You need to start with something that you're interested in and work from there. I am, of course, happy to debate what people's particular interests are and point them towards the book that I think might suit them best. So to wrap up with, I'm just going to use yet another quote from Crockett, which I like to think about when I'm thinking about him. He wrote, "Mayhap the best fortune of all is to be loved by a few greatly and constantly, rather than loudly applauded and instantly forgotten." And I think that that speaks to us who do family research, because the point of family history research isn't necessarily to spread things abroad, but it's to actually get back into a past and connect to people who came before us, and to remember them and to, I suppose, care about them. And whether it's your family, or for me it's Crockett's family, I think it's a very valuable thing to do. And whether we can find all the facts or not is less important than the stories that we find along the way. So that's me. You can find out more from all these various places, and I'm happy now to take questions or chat about Crockett further.